I don't quite remember why I took this job. Maybe it was because I needed the money, or because the cemetery sounded like a quiet place, or maybe it was because I had seen it in a dream even though I had never set foot there. I didn't apply, didn't interview, and no one called me. There was just a piece of paper sitting in my mailbox, caretaker needed, 64 Eldrow Lane, start tonight. And just like that, at exactly 6 p.m., I showed up. In front of me was a rusted iron gate standing alone on a patch of land with no name on Google Maps. The entire graveyard was tucked into the countryside, with no houses nearby, and it looked like a place people had tried to forget. Inside, there was no office, no manager, no staff, just a small shack, a shovel, a water barrel, and a wooden sign planted near the entrance. On that board were 10 lines of text, carved as if someone had scratched them in with a blade. 1. Lock the gate at 11:59 p.m. 2. Do not touch the gravestones marked with an X. 3. If you see someone in white standing on the path, turn around. 4. Don't dig on Thursdays. 5. If the ground starts speaking, don't listen. 6. If a grave is already open, do not fill it. 7. From 3:33 to 3:44 a.m., stay inside the shack. 8. If the church bell rings, count the chimes, if even hide. 9. If you see a family member here, do not call their name. 10. Never read the name carved into the gate. I read them and laughed out loud, probably a joke left by the previous guy to freak someone out, but still, I took out my phone and snapped a picture, just in case. Something in my gut told me these lines weren't to be ignored. I walked around to inspect the place. A few graves had sunken in, some weeds grew wild, everything looked old but manageable. A crescent moon hung behind the trees, casting pale light over the roof of the decrepit chapel. Its wooden door stood slightly ajar. I didn't go inside, not because I was scared, just because I knew I was alone here tonight, so why the hell was it open? Near 11 p.m. I walked to the gate. There was no lock, just 2 iron doors barely closed, with a rusted chain dangling like a decorative afterthought. I reached out to shut them, and right then the wind picked up. Strong enough to kick up dirt and send dry leaves scattering like footsteps in the dark. When I turned back toward the path, I saw someone standing there, dressed in white, motionless, faceless, just standing. I remembered rule #3, if you see someone in white standing on the path, turn around. I did exactly that. I turned my back and walked toward the shack. I didn't run, just steady steps, one after another. The wind howled behind me, ice cold and biting. When I reached the shack door, the feeling of being watched vanished. I shut the door, heart thumping, trying to calm down. I pulled out my phone to check the photo I took earlier, but it was gone. In its place was another photo, a photo of me standing in front of the wooden sign. I never took that. In the picture, a hand was resting on my shoulder, but I swear I was alone when I took it. I checked the timestamp, 11:59 p.m., right when I had shut the gate. I looked out the window. The gate was now wide open, but this time it wasn't open outward like before. It had opened from the inside. I didn't sleep that night. I tried really, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt like someone was standing just outside the shack, breathing against the wood, waiting for me to open the door. I ended up sitting in the corner, knees pulled close, watching the hours crawl by until dawn. When the sun finally rose, I stumbled out, half expecting the cemetery to look different, maybe burnt down or swallowed by the earth, but it looked the same, quiet still. Like nothing had happened, I walked back to the gate, and sure enough, it was locked again. The chain was wrapped tightly this time, and a small piece of paper was tucked between the bars. It wasn't there before. I unfolded it with shaking hands. The handwriting was jagged and uneven. You broke rule 3. You turned around, but you looked too long. That last part hit me like a punch in the chest. I hadn't realized it. But yeah, I had looked a second too long before turning my back. I don't know how whoever or whatever wrote this knew that, but they were right. And if they knew that, what else did they know? I spent the rest of the morning trimming the grass, pretending to work like this was just a normal job, trying to ignore the occasional whisper of wind that sounded too much like a voice, or the way certain headstones seemed to tilt ever so slightly when I wasn't looking. Around noon, I found one of the gravestones marked with a faint red X. It was almost hidden beneath overgrown ivy. Rule 2 flashed in my mind: do not touch the gravestones marked with an X. I backed away, but not before noticing the name etched into it: Eliza Harker, 1893-1921. I didn't know why that name felt familiar, but it stuck to my thoughts like sap that night. I locked the gate before 11:59. I stayed inside the shack, sat in the corner again, this time with a flashlight in one hand and a rusty crowbar in the other. At exactly 3:33 a.m., I heard the church bell ring once. I froze, counting the seconds, then it rang again and again. I counted 4 chimes before it went silent, even number. Rule 8, if the church bell rings, count the chimes, if even higher. I stayed exactly where I was. Heart pounding in my throat, I didn't move until daylight. On the 3rd day, something changed. I found a small black notebook tucked inside the mailbox outside the shack. No return address, no explanation. The first page simply read, caretaker's log. The rest of the pages were filled with short, messy entries. Some were just dates followed by single words, cold, watching, Doug. Others were full of panic scribbles, and the further I flipped, the worse they got. One page near the middle had nothing but the phrase, "She walks in the fog," written over and over until the ink bled through. I thought about throwing it away, but something told me this wasn't just a diary, it was a warning. Later that evening, as the sky turned gray and the trees began to sway, I noticed fog rolling in from the west side of the cemetery. Thick, unnatural fog. I didn't wait. I ran straight back to the shack and locked myself in. But just before I closed the door, I glanced back. In the fog, near Eliza Harker's grave, I saw a figure standing perfectly still. A woman in old-fashioned clothes. She was barefoot and her feet weren't touching the ground. I slammed the door shut and didn't sleep a second that night. In the morning, there were muddy footprints on the porch, barefoot prints, small and narrow, and a new rule had been carved into the wooden sign outside. Rule 11, if she walks, do not speak her name. That day I stayed close to the shack, sweeping leaves, avoiding the X-marked gravestones, and doing my best not to think about the footprints or the figure in the fog. But that evening, as the sun dipped behind the treetops and shadows stretched long across the cemetery, I saw something that made my stomach drop. One of the graves near the center had been disturbed. The soil was loose, dark, freshly turned. And the shovel, which I had left leaning against the shack, was now stuck into the ground beside it. My first instinct was to run, but I forced myself to walk closer. There was no name on the headstone, just smooth stone with moss creeping up from the base. The hole was shallow, not a full grave, just enough to look like someone had tried to start digging before giving up. Rule 6 came back to me. If a grave is already open, do not fill it. I stepped back, careful not to touch anything. As I turned to leave, something shiny caught my eye. Half buried in the dirt near the headstone was a small silver locket, crusted with dried mud. I shouldn't have touched it, but something about it felt wrong to leave behind. I picked it up and opened it. Inside was a black and white photo of a little girl, maybe 5 years old, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, sitting stiffly on a wooden chair. There was no smile. Her eyes were off, not scared, not blank. Just watching, I slammed it shut and stuffed it into my pocket, immediately regretting it. That night, I stayed inside the shack again. I placed the locket on the table and tried not to look at it. At 3:33 a.m., I sat in silence, watching the minute hand tick by, flashlight in hand. No bells rang, no voices, just silence. But at exactly 3:44, just as I was about to relax, the shack creaked. Not from the wind, not from the cold, but like something heavy had stepped onto the porch. Then another step, then a third, and then silence again. I didn't move, I didn't breathe. Eventually the tension broke with a sharp knock on the door. Once, then nothing. I didn't answer, I didn't dare. When morning came, I opened the door and found the locket gone. In its place, carved into the wooden table with something sharp, were 4 words, "Give her back now." I searched the cemetery, but the locket was nowhere to be found. I checked my pockets, my bag, even under the floorboards of the shack. Nothing. And then I noticed something new on the sign. Someone or something had scratched a line through Rule 10. The one that said, "Never read the name carved into the gate." It was no longer scratched out. It had been revealed. The letters glowed faintly in the morning sun, carved deep and jagged, Eliza Harker. I realized then the girl in the photo wasn't just anyone. She was the cemetery's rulemaker, the enforcer, the one who watched from the fog, and I had taken something that belonged to her. That night I didn't sleep. I didn't even close my eyes. Because now I knew the rules weren't warnings, they were boundaries, and I had just stepped outside of them. I started keeping notes after that night, not just about the rules, but about everything. The weather, the gravestones that moved, the trees that creaked even when there was no wind, the whispers I sometimes heard near the chapel, even the way the ground would sometimes shift ever so slightly under my feet. It made me feel like the cemetery was breathing, like it wasn't just a place but a living thing, aware of me, watching my every move. The journal filled up faster than I expected, and I began to notice patterns. The fog always came from the west, the bells never rang 2 nights in a row, the figure in white only appeared when I thought about leaving. And Eliza always showed up when something had been taken or broken or ignored. That morning I found a dead bird nailed to the shack door. I don't know how it got there, but its wings were spread wide like a crucifix, and its eyes had been scratched out. Taped to its chest was another note, written in the same jagged hand as before. Don't forget Rule 4. I reread it in my head. Rule 4, don't dig on Thursdays. I checked the date, it was Thursday. The grave I saw disturbed the night before, the one with the locket, must have been dug that day, but I hadn't touched it. I swear, so who did, and why was I being warned? I went to check the grave again, but this time it was sealed. Perfectly packed soil. No sign it had ever been open, and the headstone that once had no name now read, Caretaker Unnamed. I stepped back, chills crawling down my spine. That wasn't just any grave anymore, that was for me. That afternoon, as I raked the leaves near the eastern edge of the cemetery, I noticed something strange, another gate, almost hidden behind a thick wall of brambles. I hadn't seen it before, and it wasn't on the map I had sketched of the grounds. The metal was blackened, twisted like it had been burned, and on its frame was a plaque that read, "Do not enter under any circumstance." There was no rule on the board about this gate, no mention of it in the logbook, but something told me this was the rule that was never written down. That night I heard music playing from the chapel, faint, old, like a piano being played slowly with only a few notes at a time. I went to the door, hesitated, then opened it. Inside, the pews were empty, dust-covered. But the piano at the front had a single candle lit on it, flickering. I didn't go further. I closed the door and backed away. The next morning, the chapel door was wide open, and a new message had been carved into the wood above it. Some doors close on their own, others wait for you. I didn't know what that meant, but I knew this. Every rule had a cost, and every mistake had a watcher. And now, they were watching more closely than ever. I started setting alarms, one for 11:45 p.m. to remind me to lock the gate early, one for 3:30 a.m. so I'd be awake before the dead time, and one at exactly 3:44 a.m. so I'd know when the danger passed, but it didn't matter. The night always came too quickly, and the minutes between 3:33 and 3:44 felt like an eternity. On the 5th night, something new happened. Just as I turned off the lights and sat quietly in the corner of the shack, I heard a voice outside. Not a whisper like before, a clear voice, a woman's voice. "You have something that belongs to her," it said. I froze, my hands tightened around the flashlight. I didn't speak, I didn't even breathe. Then came 3 slow knocks on the door, 1, 2, 3, just like before. I waited. Nothing. I wanted to believe it was my mind playing tricks. But the fear sitting in my chest told me otherwise. When morning finally came, I opened the door and found a drawing taped to it. It was done in charcoal, rough and frantic, like someone had drawn it with shaking hands. It was a picture of me sitting in the corner of the shack, clutching my flashlight, but there was someone else in the drawing too, a shadow behind me. A woman with no face, long hair covering her shoulders, standing just inches away. I didn't sleep that day. I walked the entire cemetery, trying to burn energy, trying to calm the buzzing anxiety in my head. That's when I noticed a second wooden board beside the original rule sign. I was sure it hadn't been there before. The wood was newer, less worn, but the carving style was the same, like someone had dragged a blade through it with shaking hands. It had only one rule on it. Rule 12, do not write your own rule. I didn't understand it, not yet, that evening. When I sat in the shack with the lantern lit, I opened the caretaker's journal again. Flipping through, I noticed something strange. The last few pages had changed. Where before they were filled with scribbles and scattered warnings, now they were blank, except for the final page. On that page in my handwriting, though I had never written it, were the words, "If you break the wrong rule, you become one." I stared at that sentence for a long time. What did it mean, become what? I slammed the journal shut and paced the shack, trying to shake the thought from my head, but it wouldn't go away. That night, just before 3:30 a.m., I saw light coming from the cemetery path. Not lantern light, not a flashlight. It was bluish-white, glowing softly like moonlight filtered through fog. I stepped to the window and looked out. A line of figures stood along the path, motionless, dressed in burial clothes. Some looked fresh, others old, bones visible through ragged skin. None of them moved, none of them blinked. They were waiting for me. I stayed inside. When 3:44 a.m. passed, the light vanished. When dawn came, they were gone, but the fear stayed. It stayed in my chest, in my bones. Like a sickness that wouldn't pass, that day I made a mistake. I tried to make a new rule. I carved it into a loose plank on the shack wall, thinking maybe I could protect myself. It read, "Do not speak after midnight." I thought it was harmless. I thought I could add my own protections. That night, just after midnight, I opened my mouth to pray, just a whisper, a single word, and my throat closed. I choked. I fell to the floor, gasping for air. The pain was sharp. Invisible fingers pressing around my neck. I couldn't scream, couldn't cry. Just as I felt like I was going to black out, it stopped. I lay there for minutes, coughing and trembling. The shack was empty. No one was there. But when I turned to the plank where I carved my rule, it was blank again, scratched clean. And underneath it, burned into the wood, were 5 words: "You are not in charge." I stopped trying to understand the rules after that night. They weren't just guidelines. They were laws, and whatever lived in the cemetery wasn't just enforcing them. It was waiting for me to step out of line again. I spent the morning repairing the old fence along the southern edge of the grounds, trying to focus on physical labor to drown out the noise in my head. But even then, the silence around me felt heavier, like the air itself was listening. By noon, I found another change. A small wooden box had appeared beside the chapel steps. It hadn't been there before. It looked old, handmade, with no lock, no label, just a lid sealed shut with wax. I should have ignored it, but curiosity got the better of me. I brought it back to the shack, sat down at the table, and broke the wax seal. Inside was a bundle of human hair, long, dark, and tied with a red string, and a single matchbook from a diner I'd never heard of. On the inside of the matchbook cover, someone had written, "Burn what you fear." That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the box closed, but I couldn't stop staring at it. I wanted to burn it, to follow the message, but something told me not to. At exactly 3:33 a.m., the church bell rang once, then twice, then a third time. I held my breath. The 4th ring never came. I waited, counting the seconds, hoping it had just stopped early, but then came the 5th chime. An odd number, rule 8, if even hide, so what now? Was I safe, or did the rule change again without warning? Suddenly, the shack door creaked just a little, just enough to let a sliver of cold air slip in. I raised my flashlight, heart pounding, and stepped forward, but the door wasn't open. The lock was still latched. The sound hadn't come from that door. It came from the trap door beneath the rug, the one I had never touched. I didn't even know it could open. Slowly, I peeled back the rug. There it was, a small wooden hatch built into the floor. The handle was old, iron, and cold to the touch. I lifted it. Beneath was a dark crawl space that smelled of damp earth and something else, something sweet and rock. I dropped the hatch shut immediately and shoved the table over it. I didn't want to know what was down there. At dawn, I went back outside. The chapel door was open again. Inside, on the altar, was a single white candle, burning without a flame. I don't know how to explain that. The wick wasn't glowing. There was no fire, but the wax was melting. Behind the candle, etched into the altar wood, were 5 new words. "The ground remembers your name." I backed away slowly and didn't return the rest of the day. That evening I saw movement in the cemetery, a boy maybe 10 years old running between the graves. He was laughing, calling for someone named Mr., giggling like it was a game. I called out to him, asked if he was lost, but he didn't answer. Just ran behind a large headstone and disappeared. I followed. When I turned the corner, he was gone, but etched into the stone he vanished behind were the words, "Play with me again." That night I heard children laughing outside the shack, soft, distant like echoes, but each time I moved they stopped. When I stayed still they came back. The laughter circled the shack like a skipping record, never quite reaching the walls. At exactly 3:33 a.m. everything went quiet, completely. No wind, no insects, no voices. Just silence, then came a single whisper from beneath the floorboards, "Do you want to play?" I didn't answer. I didn't breathe. I sat there, staring at the table, at the box with the hair and matchbook still sitting unopened. I knew then what I had to do. At dawn, I took the box outside, set it beside the chapel, struck a match, and dropped it in. The hair curled and blackened, the wax popped and hissed. As it burned, the fog rolled in not from the west, but from beneath the ground, rising through the soil like steam. For a moment, I thought I saw her again, Eliza, watching from the trees, but when I blinked, she was gone. All that remained was the smell of ash and a new line on the second rule board. Rule 13, don't play with the dead. After I burned the box, the cemetery changed. Not in any way I could prove. No thunder cracked the sky, no graves burst open, but I felt it in the stillness. In the way the wind moved through the trees like it was circling me instead of blowing past. Even the birds that used to perch on the fences had vanished. That day I walked to the edge of the western woods where the fog usually rolled in. I stood still for almost an hour, just watching, waiting, daring it to show itself again, but nothing came. Just before sunset, I noticed something different, a grave I hadn't seen before, right at the border where the trees met the tombstones. It was small, maybe for a child, and covered in pale, rotting lilies. The headstone was blank, no name, no date, no markings, just cold stone and dead flowers. Rule 5 whispered in my head, do not leave flowers on graves you don't recognize, but these were already here. Someone had broken the rule before me, or worse, they were testing me. I didn't touch the flowers, I didn't touch anything. That night I lit every candle I had in the shack and sat in the center of the room. I had the caretaker's journal in one hand and the crowbar in the other. I didn't expect either to help, but they were the only things that felt real anymore. At 3:33 a.m. the wind stopped, not slowed, stopped completely. It was like someone pressed pause on the world. The silence pressed in on my ears like water. Then came the music, a soft lullaby playing from somewhere outside. It wasn't the piano this time. It was a music box, the kind you had to crank by hand. The tune was delicate, off-key old. I looked out the window and saw a figure sitting on the chapel steps, small, still. A girl, her back was turned, head tilted to the side as if listening to the song. I didn't go out, I didn't move, I just stared. After a minute, she turned her head slightly, just enough that I saw her cheek, pale, cracked like porcelain. Her mouth didn't move, but I heard her voice in my head as clear as a scream. I remember you. I dropped the flashlight. When I looked again, she was gone. The music had stopped. The next morning, the chapel door was nailed shut. Dozens of rusted nails hammered in a circle across the frame, sealing it completely. I didn't do that, and no one else was here. I walked up slowly, heart pounding, and found a message burned into the wood just above the nails. It read, "Don't open what others have sealed." I backed away. I didn't even breathe until I was halfway back to the shack. That afternoon, as I cleaned the eastern path, I saw something else, the boy from before, the one who had disappeared behind the gravestone. He was standing beneath the old willow tree, facing me. His eyes were black, not hollow, not like pits, but like mirrors. I took one step forward. He smiled. Then he pointed at the shack. I turned, expecting something behind me, but there was nothing. When I looked back, he was gone again. That night, I moved my mattress off the trapdoor. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to know what was underneath. I opened the hatch slowly, flashlight in hand, and crawled down. The space was tighter than I expected, barely high enough to sit upright. The dirt floor was cold and damp. There were symbols carved into the beams above, strange, jagged shapes I couldn't recognize. And in the center, half buried in the dirt, was a second journal. I pulled it out and opened it. The first page read, "Caretaker before me." The entries were worse than anything I'd seen. Pages full of frantic writing, drawings of faceless children, headstones cracked in half, words like return, repent, replace. Near the end, the writing broke into scrawls, nothing but "she sees me" repeated dozens of times. The final page simply said, "They are not buried, they are waiting." I crawled back up and sealed the hatch that night. I didn't wait for the bell, I waited for her. That night felt longer than any before. I sat with my back to the wall, flashlight in hand, every candle burning low. The air inside the shack felt heavier, like I was being pressed into the floor by something unseen. The moment the clock hit 3:33 a.m., a single bell rang in the distance, not from the chapel, but from underground. I swear I felt the floorboards vibrate under me. Then silence. Not even my breath made a sound. I couldn't move, couldn't think. And then 3 knocks on the wall behind me. Not the door, the wall, solid wood, no entrance, but something was there, waiting, watching. I didn't turn around. I stayed frozen until the clock struck 3:44 and the air shifted back to normal. The next morning I walked straight to the caretaker's second journal, the one from the crawl space. I flipped to the middle, scanning for anything about knocks, about underground bells, about her. One entry caught my eye. Dated 13 years ago, it read, "If she knocks 3 times, don't listen. If you answer, she enters. If you turn, she follows." I closed the book and ran outside, needing air, needing sun. But what I saw instead made my knees nearly buckle. Dozens of fresh footprints in the dew, circling the shack, child-sized, bare, leading nowhere. They just stopped. That day I tried to quit. I packed a bag, walked to the front gate, but something stopped me, not fear, not logic. It was like the trees themselves leaned in, whispering, "You're not done yet." And deep down, I knew they were right. I couldn't leave, not without answers, not without finishing what had started long before I arrived. I went back to the chapel, now nailed shut, and sat on the steps. I whispered, "What do you want from me?" The wind picked up, leaves swirled at my feet, and then, as if answering, a single petal from a pale lily landed on my lap, from the child's grave. The one with no name. I stood, heart pounding, and returned to that grave. The lilies were gone. The headstone now bore a name, Eliza Harker. I stepped back, breath caught in my throat. That name, it had once been scratched onto the rule board, now it was carved in stone. The earth beneath my feet groaned, low and slow, like something massive shifting below. I didn't run. I whispered again, "What do you want from me?" That night I waited. I didn't light any candles. I didn't lock the shack. I left the door wide open. At 3:33 the knock came again, but this time not from the wall, from the front door. And a voice followed, soft, childlike. "It's cold outside, may I come in?" I didn't speak. The voice came again, "Please, I'm so cold." I closed my eyes, and then I said it. Yes, nothing happened. The air stayed still, the door stayed open, and when I finally opened my eyes, she was there. Eliza, standing just inside the door, hair long and damp, eyes dark as the soil. She didn't move, just stared. And then she whispered, "You broke the rules, but you're still here." I nodded. I didn't know what else to do. "Why me?" I asked. She tilted her head. "Because you listen, most don't." Then she turned and walked back out the door, vanishing into the fog. On the table behind her, a new rule had appeared, etched deep into the wood grain. Rule 14, when she knocks, let her speak. After Eliza left, nothing returned to normal. If anything, everything felt even more fragile. The air, the ground, the rules, like the whole place was holding its breath. I waited for something to shift, for her to return, for the night to scream again, but it didn't. The next morning, the rule board had changed. Not just the new rule, but the others too. Some had been scratched out entirely. Rule 2 gone. Rule 5 blurred to illegibility. Rule 8 burned away at the edges like it had been lit on fire. It was like the rules themselves were decaying or rewriting. I sat on the steps of the chapel, notebook in hand, trying to list the ones I remembered. But every time I wrote one down, a different version echoed in my mind. If even hide, or was it if odd run? I wasn't sure anymore. That terrified me more than anything. That I was losing the thread. That whatever was happening here was slipping through my grip. That day the fog never left. Usually it came around dusk or just after midnight. But now it hung over the ground like a disease, thick and wet, curling around the trees and headstones like it was searching. I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. I tied a rope from the shack to the chapel just so I wouldn't get lost in my own footsteps. Every sound was amplified, the crunch of gravel, the creak of branches, the distant clang of something metal being dragged across stone. I stayed inside as much as I could, pacing the shack, rereading the caretaker journals over and over, looking for patterns. I found something. One entry written long ago mentioned a night when the fog never left. The caretaker then had stayed awake for 3 nights straight before something knocked on the trapdoor from underneath. It didn't knock 3 times. It knocked once, then again, then silence, then again. The pattern was always the same. One pause, one. That night I heard the same thing. I was lying on the floor, half asleep, when it came. One knock, then another, then silence, then the third. I froze. I didn't even breathe. I waited for more, but nothing came. Morning arrived slowly. No sun, just lighter fog. The rope leading to the chapel was gone, severed. I followed the path blind, hands out, and made it to the steps only by muscle memory. The door was still nailed shut, but now there was a handprint on it, small, black like ash or tar. The fingers were too long. That night the fog crept under the shack door, not fast, just slowly. Like it knew I was watching. I stuffed rags under the threshold. It didn't stop. I watched the lantern flicker and dim. Then just before 3:33 the light died completely. I was alone in the dark, and then breathing, not mine, not inside the shack, but outside, circling, shallow, wet like lungs filled with mud. I didn't dare move, and then came the knock again, but not from the trap door, not the door, from the window. I turned slowly, on the other side of the glass. Barely visible in the fog was a face, pale, eyes black, hair long. Eliza. No, this wasn't her. The skin was too tight, like it had been stretched and stapled to the bone. The mouth was open, frozen in a silent scream. It didn't move, it just watched, and then it was gone, just vanished. Morning never really came, the fog thinned, but the light never bright. I went outside, shaking, and found another change. The graves were open, not all of them, just the oldest. The dirt piled beside them, no signs of digging, just open, as if something had climbed out, or worse, never truly rested. I didn't check inside, I couldn't. I walked the grounds until dusk, then returned to the shack, knowing full well that something was building, that the rules were unraveling, that soon I might not be able to tell what was real and what wasn't. And worst of all, I felt it, deep inside. I wasn't afraid anymore, I was curious. The moment I admitted my curiosity, everything changed. It was like the cemetery had been waiting for me to break, not in fear, but in interest. That night I didn't hide, I didn't light candles. I sat by the window and stared out into the fog, waiting for it to speak. And it did. At exactly 3:33 a.m. a voice came through, not from the door, not from the trap door or the wall or the window, but from everywhere all at once. It whispered, "You're close." I didn't reply, I just sat there, heart racing but mind still, and whispered back, "To what?" No answer. Only a shift in the air, a drop in temperature, and the sudden extinguishing of all warmth in the room. The fog pressed against the glass like it was trying to get in, and maybe it already had. That morning the graves that had been opened were sealed again, but the headstones had changed. Names I didn't recognize before were now etched into the marble, new names. Some with dates from this week. One of them had today's date, and it read, "You." I stumbled back, blinking, but when I looked again it was blank, just smooth stone, no name, no date. I wasn't sure anymore if I was seeing what was there or what it wanted me to see. Later I returned to the second journal. Something about it had been bothering me for days. The entries weren't just warnings, they were instructions. Not all but a few, some were questions. Written over and over, what lies beneath, who writes the rules, and one that chilled me more than the rest, what happens when the caretaker forgets. I flipped to the last page, which I hadn't dared to read until now. It was different. The handwriting had changed, smoother, clearer. It simply said, "You must write the rules." That day I found a third board nailed behind the chapel, hidden beneath ivy and broken stone. This one was blank, not a single rule on it. But at the bottom, carved deep, were the words, "Begin again." I stood there for a long time, not knowing whether to scream or cry or run, but instead I went back to the shack and took a piece of chalk. That night I stared at the empty wall beside the door and wrote, "Rule 1, never trust what speaks in your voice." I stared at it for hours, wondering if I had just cursed myself or saved something. Then I added a second, "Rule 2, if the rules disappear, write your own." That night the bell didn't ring, the fog didn't come, the face didn't appear, but I didn't sleep. At 3:33 the wind returned, soft, swirling, and cold. And with it a voice behind my ear, "Good, you're learning." I spun around, no one was there, just the door creaking slightly. A single piece of paper had been slipped under it. On it a drawing, a circle of graves with one in the center, darker than the rest. Beneath it, "She's waiting below." The trapdoor, I knew I had to open it again, but not yet, I needed to prepare. The next day I mapped the graveyard. Every stone, every tree, every point the fog touched. I marked the circle from the drawing and realized something I hadn't noticed before. The cemetery was a perfect ring. Every path, every gate, every rule, it all led to the center. And at that center, under the oldest gravestone, was something buried deeper than the rest. Something no one had touched, something waiting. That night I wrote a third rule. Rule 3, the center is not empty. I slept with the journal clutched to my chest, not for comfort, but because I was afraid someone or something would write in it if I let go. The next night I stood at the edge of the grave in the center of the map, the one beneath the old willow tree, the one no one had touched, and I realized something. I wasn't scared anymore, not in the way I used to be. Fear had turned into obsession, and obsession had become a kind of quiet purpose. I held the drawing that had been slipped under my door and looked at the dark grave in the center of the circle. It matched perfectly. I walked back to the shack. Grabbed the shovel I hadn't used since Rule 4 was posted. Do not dig on Thursdays, and checked the calendar. It was Wednesday. I had a day. I spent that entire day reading both journals again, looking for mentions of the center, the grave under the willow, anything. But there was nothing, as if that spot had been erased or deliberately ignored. That night the wind didn't come. The fog stayed still. It felt like the whole cemetery was holding its breath. I didn't sleep. I waited until the clock hit midnight, then I walked slowly to the willow tree, shovel in hand. Every step echoed like it was inside a tunnel. The moonlight barely cut through the branches above me. When I reached the grave, I hesitated. The headstone had no name, no date, no carving at all, just smooth, dark granite. I pressed the blade of the shovel into the soil and expected resistance, but the ground gave way like sand. I dug for what felt like hours. The sweat cold against my skin, and then metal. A box about the size of a coffin buried 6 feet down. It wasn't wood, it was iron bolted shut, and on top of it, burned into the surface, a word, caretaker. I stepped back, breath gone, hands shaking. My name wasn't on it, but I knew it was mine, or it would be. I stared at it for a long time, then covered it back up. I didn't have the courage to open it, not yet. When I returned to the shack, the trapdoor was open. I hadn't touched it, it hadn't been open when I left, but now the ladder stretched down into darkness, and from below I heard humming, not a song I recognized, not something melodic, just low, steady, unsettling. I closed it and placed the heaviest chair I had on top. Then I wrote a new rule on the wall, Rule 4, if the ground gives too easily, stop digging. That morning, a fourth journal appeared on the doorstep, bound in red leather, older than the others. Pages yellowed and brittle. I opened it and saw handwriting I didn't recognize, perfect, neat, like it had been written by a machine. The first page simply read, "This is not your story, you are just the pen." My hands went cold. I flipped through and found pages already written, describing what I had done the night before in exact detail, every word, even my thoughts. Then at the end, a final line I hadn't lived yet. "Tonight, you open the box." I slammed it shut and threw it across the room, but I already knew I wouldn't ignore it. The rules weren't just being enforced anymore. They were being written as I lived them, or maybe I was only catching up to what was already decided. That night, I didn't wait until 3:33. I left the shack just after midnight and walked straight to the willow tree. This time, I brought a crowbar and gloves. I didn't bother with candles or rope. I already knew my way by instinct. The fog had cleared, the air strangely still, as if everything had paused for this moment. I uncovered the soil again with shaking hands, layer by layer, until the iron box showed itself once more. It didn't feel cold this time. It felt warm, like something inside was alive. I ran my fingers along the words still etched across the top, caretaker. I hesitated only once before slipping the crowbar under the seam and pressing down. It creaked, then popped. The lid slid open with a reluctant groan, and inside, nothing. At first, just blackness, but then my flashlight caught something in the far corner, a bundle of pages wrapped in what looked like linen. I reached in and pulled it out. It was heavier than it looked. I opened the fabric slowly and found a book, old, bound in cracked skin, the edges curled and stained. The title on the cover had been scratched out completely, replaced with a single sentence burned into the leather. "Rules are bones, break one and something snaps." I didn't understand it at first. Then I flipped to the first page and froze. It wasn't blank. It was a mirror, not a literal one, but the page reflected my own memories, written exactly as they had happened. My first day at the cemetery. My first mistake, the box of bones, Eliza, the humming, the face at the window, all of it written there before I had ever spoken them aloud. It was writing me, or recording me, or worse, controlling me. I shut the book fast and stood up, heart slamming in my chest. The sky above the willow had turned darker, as if the stars had pulled back. I heard whispers, low and tangled, coming from beneath the soil. Then the headstone behind me cracked. I spun around and saw a hand, gray, slim, and still, pressing through the dirt. I couldn't move. It didn't reach for me. It just lay there, fingers curled slightly upward, like it was asking for something. I dropped the book back into the box and shoved the lid closed. The hand retreated instantly. I buried the box again as fast as I could. Then I ran, not to the shack, but to the chapel. The door was still nailed shut, but the nails had started to rust and fall. I counted 7 missing, a gap wide enough to see through. I leaned in and saw rows of pews turn to dust. Candles melted down to puddles, and at the far end a figure kneeling, not moving, draped in what looked like funeral cloth. I whispered, "Eliza." The figure didn't stir, but the door vibrated beneath my hand. I backed away, returned to the shack, locked everything. That night I couldn't sleep. I wrote 2 more rules on the wall. Rule 5, if the dead offer you something, don't take it. Rule 6, if a book knows your story, it's not a book, it's a mirror. Just before dawn. I heard laughter, not from the fog, not from the trapdoor, from inside the shack, just behind me. A child's giggle. When I turned, nothing was there, but one of the rules had changed. Rule 1 was now crossed out, replaced with a new sentence. "You're not the first, you won't be the last." And beneath it, scratched in tiny letters I didn't write, "She's coming back." I didn't sleep after the laughter. I sat in the corner of the shack, knees pulled to my chest, flashlight in hand, watching the walls like they might breathe. When the sun came up, I stepped outside only to find that the headstones had changed again. Some names were missing, others were completely new, but one thing stayed the same. The center grave under the willow remained untouched on the surface, as if nothing had happened the night before, but I knew what lay beneath: the iron box, the book. The hand, I didn't go near it. Instead, I walked the outer perimeter of the cemetery, tracing the old fence line. That's when I found something that hadn't been there before: a gate. Rusted, half buried in vines, tucked between two leaning trees. It creaked open with a sound like bones grinding. Beyond it, a narrow path led into the woods, a path I was certain hadn't existed before. Still, I followed it. I needed answers, and this place had never given anything without a price. The trail twisted through the trees like a snake, coiling tighter and tighter until I couldn't tell how far I'd gone or if I was even still on cemetery ground. Eventually, the trees opened into a small clearing. In the center stood a statue, weathered, moss-covered, but clearly human. It was a woman holding a child, both carved in exquisite detail, and on the base was a plaque that read, "To those who listen." The same words Eliza had whispered to me. I stepped closer. And the air shifted. The ground beneath the statue cracked, revealing a small wooden door just barely large enough to crawl through. Something in me said no. Every instinct screamed, but I opened it anyway. Inside was a tunnel, earthen walls supported by rotting wood beams, the air thick with decay and something sweeter, like old perfume. I crawled forward, the space narrowing with every foot, until I entered a chamber lit by a single, flickering candle. In the center sat a chair. And on that chair, the caretaker's uniform, folded neatly, pressed, waiting. Beside it, a pair of black leather boots and a name tag that simply said, "Yours." I didn't touch it. I backed out slowly, heart pounding, and sealed the hatch behind me. When I returned to the cemetery, the gate was gone, as if it had never been there. That night, I didn't go to the shack. I slept in the chapel, curled between two ruined pews. I lit every candle I had and waited. At 3:33, nothing happened. No wind, no fog, no voices, just silence. Until a figure stepped through the front door, the one that had been nailed shut for weeks. She walked in as if she owned the place. Eliza, older now, or maybe just different. Her eyes glowed faintly, her hands pale and cold. She sat in the pew beside me and whispered, "You found the path." I didn't answer. She smiled sadly. The rules were never meant to save you, only to slow you down. I swallowed hard. What happens if I stop following them? Her smile faded. "Then they follow you." I looked away, unsure what that even meant, but she leaned in closer and added, "The cemetery doesn't want a keeper, it wants a witness." And then she stood and walked out the way she came, leaving behind only a single white lily on the bench. I didn't sleep. I etched 2 more rules on the chapel wall with a broken piece of stone. Rule 7, the path appears when you're almost ready. Rule 8, the rules were never yours, they were warnings. Just before dawn, I heard the trapdoor in the shack slam open from a distance. Something had come up, or was waiting for me to come down. I didn't go down into the trapdoor that morning, not yet, but I stood at the edge of it for a long time listening. There was no sound, no breathing, no whispers, no humming like before, just stillness, which somehow made it worse. I knew whatever waited below wasn't asleep. It was waiting for me. The journals didn't help anymore. They were filled, pages covered in my handwriting now. Not thoughts, not observations, but rules. Dozens of them, some crossed out, others were written. The wall inside the shack had no more room. The original rules had faded. I couldn't remember which ones came first anymore. I felt like I was becoming the rules, like they were part of me now. That morning, a small envelope appeared on the chapel's front step. No stamp, no address, just my name. Inside was a photograph, black and white, blurry. It showed me standing next to the central grave, but from above, as if taken from the sky. I hadn't been up there. No one else had either. On the back, written in perfect cursive, were the words, "Almost done." I burned the photo in the chapel candle and watched the ashes curl. That night I made a decision, no more waiting. I packed everything I needed, flashlight, rope, the mirror book from the box under the willow, and returned to the shack just before midnight. I moved the chair, opened the trapdoor, and climbed down. The ladder creaked, every step groaning like it hated my weight. At the bottom was a dirt tunnel, low and damp, the air heavy with the scent of moss and rot. I walked slowly, flashlight flickering even with fresh batteries. Something didn't want me here, but I kept going. The tunnel curved downward, deeper and deeper, until I reached a chamber. large, circular, carved entirely from stone. In the center was a stone table, and on it the journals, all of them, even ones I hadn't written yet. I recognized my handwriting, but there were pages from the future. Descriptions of things I hadn't seen, actions I hadn't taken. On one page it said, "You will sit, you will decide," and beneath it, "Only one leaves." I backed away. Behind the table stood a mirror tall, full length, covered by a sheet. I pulled the cloth away. My reflection blinked, but I hadn't. It smiled. I didn't. Then it whispered, "Ready?" I stepped back, heart hammering. But the door behind me had vanished. No tunnel, just stone. I was trapped. The mirror stepped forward, my reflection, but not. It wore the caretaker's uniform. Its eyes were darker. It said, "Sit." I sat, I didn't know why. My body moved before I could think. The reflection sat across from me. "One of us stays," it said. "The other watches." I didn't answer. "This place doesn't want order," it continued. "It wants memory, witness, echo." Then it handed me a journal I hadn't seen before. I opened it, blank. The first page read, "Write the final rule." My hands shook. I looked up. The reflection waited. And so, with a pen I didn't remember bringing, I wrote Rule 9, "When you reach the end, choose who stays behind." The mirror smiled, the room shook, and then I was back, standing in the shack, trapped or sealed, the journals gone. Only one remained blank except for my name on the cover, and a single line inside, "You stayed." I didn't know if that meant I was the witness, or the memory, or just another version of someone else who had once walked the same path. All I knew was this: the cemetery was quiet again. The rules had stopped writing themselves, but the grave under the willow still waited. The following days blurred together. I don't know how long I stayed inside the shack after that night. The journal with my name on the cover remained closed. I was afraid to open it again. I swept the floor, cleaned the windows, trimmed the grass around the graves, but none of it felt like maintenance anymore. It felt like ritual, like I was being watched every time I did anything that resembled care. The cemetery had gone silent. No whispers, no fog. No rules reappearing on the walls. The stillness wasn't peaceful, it was waiting. One morning I stepped outside and found a visitor standing by the entrance gate. A man in a suit, clean-shaven, holding a clipboard. He looked completely out of place, like he belonged in an office building, not on overgrown cemetery grass. He smiled and asked, "Are you the groundskeeper?" I didn't answer. He clicked his pen and continued, "I'm here to confirm the transition. Final evaluation." I asked what he meant, and he just said, "Don't worry, if the rules held, you'll know what to do." Then he walked the perimeter, scribbling notes, nodding to himself. When he returned, he handed me a slip of paper. It was a list, not of rules, but names, dozens of them. Some I recognized, others I didn't. And at the very bottom, my own. Beside it, 2 boxes, remain and release. Neither was checked. He told me, "The cemetery has decided. Now it's your turn." And then he left through the gate, which closed silently behind him. I sat in the chapel that night, staring at that list under candlelight, wondering what it all meant. Was this a test? Had it always been? I remembered what the mirror had said: one of us stays, one watches, one writes, but there was no instruction anymore, no rules to follow. Just silence and the growing awareness that this place didn't need a keeper. It needed someone to continue the story. I opened the journal again, the blank one. My hands trembled as I flipped to the first page. It was no longer empty. There were words now: "Your watch has ended," and beneath it, "She is waking." I dropped the journal. Outside, the wind began to howl. First in days, candles blew out one by one. I rushed back to the shack, but when I opened the door, the walls were covered in writing again. Not mine, older, scribbled in dozens of hands. They all said the same thing. Over and over, "She returns when the list is full." The list. I ran to the chapel, pulled out the paper again. My name was the last one, the final blank. A choice: remain or release. The pen lay beside it. I didn't know what would happen either way, but the trapdoor creaked open behind me without anyone touching it. And from deep below, a whisper rose, not angry, not demanding, just tired. "Choose." I stared at my name, then slowly I checked one box. I checked the box marked "Remain." The moment the pen touched the paper, the ground trembled. The whispering below turned into a slow, rhythmic breathing, as if the cemetery itself had exhaled after holding in air for years. I looked around, expecting something to emerge from the trapdoor, but nothing came. Instead, every candle in the chapel reignited on its own. A warm glow filled the room. The writing on the walls began to fade, not suddenly, but like ink dissolving into fog. Then silence, not the heavy, pressing kind from before, but peaceful, final. I stepped outside, half expecting the graves to move, the fog to roll in, the rules to return, but they didn't. The sun was rising behind the hills. The cemetery looked normal. For the first time since I arrived, it felt like the dead were truly at rest. I walked to the willow tree. The central grave was sealed, no signs of the box beneath. The roots had grown over the soil again, as if protecting it. I stood there for a long time, hand on the trunk, listening. Nothing, not even the wind. I returned to the shack and found the journal still sitting on the table. One final message had appeared inside. The story ends when it's told. You've done your part. And then below it, in a different hand, something I hadn't seen before. A message for someone else. If you're reading this, the rules are yours now. That was when I realized I wasn't the first, and I wouldn't be the last. The rules move forward, the cemetery chooses. The watcher becomes the writer becomes the story. That's why I'm sharing this, not just because it happened, but because it might happen again. Somewhere, someday, someone will find the gate again, the statues, the journal. Maybe they already have. Maybe it's you. If you ever feel called to a place that's not on any map, where the wind feels too quiet and the silence presses into your skin, where the dead don't just sleep. They listen, turn back, or don't. But remember the rules. They're not suggestions, they're survival. And if one day you hear footsteps behind you long after the cemetery gates have closed, don't run. That's just me checking in. One last time. Thank you for staying until the end. If this story stayed with you, or if you felt that strange chill down your spine tonight, consider liking the video and subscribing for more stories like this. I'll be here, watching, writing, waiting.